Welcome to the SmartTechCheck podcast, hosted by Mark Vina, your home for candid, insightful, and provocative conversations about the smart home automation, security, smartphones, PC and console gaming, and much more.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Vina, host of the SmartTechCheck podcast. Today is Thursday, June 30th, 2022. Since the 1990s, Wi-Fi has changed the landscape around the way people use PCs and mobile devices. Wi-Fi has played a pivotal role in the evolution of the smart home, with infinite devices that make us more productive, more secure, easy to automate our homes, and particularly energy savings friendly, which is always important. But the evolution of wireless capability has come at a cost. User confusion over the rapid arrival of new wireless protocols that have an alphabet soup like persona, where the benefits are not always clear. At the service provider level, enormous opportunities exist to help consumers upgrade to the latest wireless protocols, as consumers clearly desire faster broadband speeds but do not want to become home CIOs to deal with the security and home network management implications. Joining me to discuss the disruptive nature of the latest new Wi-Fi protocol known as Wi-Fi 6E is George Wang and Greg Owens, two executives from Calix, one of the leading global tech companies that provides cloud, software platform systems, and services to broadband service providers all over the world. George and Greg, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Mark.
How are you guys?
Great to be here. I'm doing great.
Yeah, glad you could make it. George, welcome to the podcast as well. I've known Greg for a long time. George, you and I are just getting to know each other. And what I like to do, because this is such an important topic for us to kind of dive into with, these wireless protocols coming almost like at a rapid speed. You can almost sometimes see consumers' eyes roll back in the head. Sometimes people are just happy to get good wireless connectivity, and they don't realize all the other benefits that come with these more advanced protocols. But before we go into that, what I want to do is bring up a slide to go over your backgrounds, because I think the backgrounds obviously are an important thing of when I speak to different folks on my podcast. So George, we'll begin with you. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, everybody. So my name is George Wang, and I've been in the Wi-Fi industry for a number of decades, actually. Obviously I came from the chip background with Qualcomm and Broadcom, leaders in the Wi-Fi chip industry. And since then, I've moved to Calix, and in the system side, very excited to see how the chip actually get deployed into a system level. So thank you.
Oh, well, you're welcome, George. It's great to have your kind of technical acumen during podcasts like this. And let me bring up Greg to kind of chime in terms of what I know. Of course, I know Greg quite well, but I'd like him to talk a little bit about his background.
Sure. I think George is underselling himself as well, to be fair. George is a real expert on all of our products and on technology in general. And if you look at what Calix has come out with, I joined Calix about 5 years ago, Mark, and we had one Wi-Fi system. It's called the Giga Center. We had a few different versions of it based on your access technology, but now we have this amazing portfolio of GigaSpire systems, and I learn something new from George every day. So I'm really glad to have him on here as well. He doesn't always get the credit that he's due. So yeah, thanks very much for introducing me, Mark. I work in the marketing organization here at Calix, coming up on 5 years. Wow, the university references, those seem like a lifetime ago. And I spent most of my career in telecoms as well. 15 years at Alcatel-Lucent, which is now owned by Nokia, mostly on the fixed access side of the business. So yeah, I've been in telecoms for quite some time.
Well, I'm very impressed that George did not date himself by telling him when he entered the workforce and what protocol was in vogue then, because we've gone through multiple revisions of the different protocols over the last 20 years or so. I can remember just the magic that happened in the late 1990s when I was at Compaq, and we all of a sudden, wireless capability became apparent with the 802.11b, if I'm not mistaken. And what was crazy, all the hurdles you had to jump through just to get a notebook computer working with your Wi-Fi network in the office. It was truly magic when it worked, but it was not always reliable, and we've come a long way since then. But let's jump into the first topic that I want to jump into, which will come up in a second here. And, the interesting thing is, from a market trend standpoint, sometimes it takes a little bit of time, but if you look at all the different projections, Wi-Fi 6, that's been out for about 2 years or so. Wi-Fi 6E has just come on board. I mean, there's no question that from a growth standpoint, the market is responding very aggressively toward Wi-Fi iterations of Wi-Fi 6 and 6E. There are obviously benefits of 6E that are very significant and tangible that we'll talk about in a second. But from a future-proofing standpoint, when you look at a market that's growing at a 14% CAGR over the period of time that I've got up here on the slide, that's a big deal. And the market is kind of responding for that kind of future-proofing aspect that these new protocols afford. So, George, let me just start with you. What's your reaction to just the general market growth and obviously why Calix is so really in a great position to offer this type of capability to its customers and to service providers?
Yeah, first of all, I think the growth reflects on the mobility that people are looking for, right? The days when you have to tie down on an Ethernet cable is gone, right? People want to be able to roam around and go anywhere they want to go. So that's the reflection of Wi-Fi has grown so quickly. Now, the really amazing thing is during COVID, the FCC really responded in a quick way to release the 6 gigahertz spectrum, right? This really helps the market tremendously because, as you were mentioning before, Mark, in 1999, when we first released the, Wi-Fi standard, those 2.4 and 5 gigahertz spectrum have been around for 20 years.
Right.
We were struggling with the limited spectrum that we have and things like that. And thanks to FCC, less than a year and a half ago, they released the 6 gigahertz. That opens up a huge chunk of spectrum, which basically allow us to do a lot of things we can't imagine, right? It's one of those things that if you build it, they will come. And I see the metaverse of the world, virtual reality, and all those things are coming because of this huge spectrum that's opened up.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the podcast in terms of the applications out there that are really going to drive the appeal of Wi-Fi 6 and 6E, especially in a much more aggressive manner. And I'm sure the word metaverse will come up. I'm sure the word AR and VR will come up during that part of the discussion. But Greg, let me just pull you into it and get your reaction to these kind of data points. I mean, there's not many product categories that are in the consumer, just in the general tech space, that are driving these kind of CAGR rates. It's obviously very appealing and very interesting to companies like Calix. But what's your reaction?
No, it's funny when George made the reference to Ethernet. It just reminded me of a conversation I had with a friend of mine about 10 years ago who was building a house and wiring every single room with Ethernet ports, right? And he's like, Wi-Fi will never catch up to the bit rates that I can get when I'm sending files between my different servers and doing my my peer-to-peer file sharing and all that stuff. And it kind of seems silly in hindsight, but I think George is spot on, right? I think it's a combination of if you build it, they will come, but also the industry is constantly coming up with new advances, right? You look at all the smart home IoT devices when they first came out and how much power they use, and all the battery powered ones became almost unusable. So you had Zigbee and Z-Wave and all these technologies coming out. Now with Wi-Fi 6 and some of the enhancements in Wi-Fi 6, those technologies, you don't hear about them anymore. Every IoT device is a Wi-Fi. It's become a ubiquitous standard for everybody. And I think George is exactly right. It's about people just want to have complete connectivity without any wires. And I think if you look at Wi-Fi 6, I know we'll talk about 6E mostly today, but just that slight improvement in coverage versus Wi-Fi 5 of only 30%, which I say slight. I think it's a big improvement. But that now that covers all your cameras and your doorbells and all the things that are on the periphery of your property. And in my case, my backyard, God forbid my kids are in the pool without having access to their Wi-Fi. That would be a catastrophe, right? So I think part of it is the industry driving it, but a lot of it is also just consumers wanting to get more out of technology, and technology is always responding. So I think it's an exciting time.
Well, just to kind of, before we hit the next slide here, I think we all look to a future when perhaps our children look at an Ethernet port it's the same way they look at a rotary phone, saying, "What the heck is that?" So hopefully the world will be embracing it in the future.
When was the last time you bought a PC that even has an Ethernet port?
An Ethernet jack. That's exactly right. No, that's that.
Yeah, you're right.
You're spot on. So let's get to our next topic here, and that is just kind of flipping the tables here on the service providers, not responsibly, but their role in delivering great Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi has gone from kind of I won't say a science project, but I'll use the phrase science project in the 90s to where we are, which is it's just kind of expected to have. 15 years ago, 20 years ago, it was really cool and it was a bright shiny object in the room when someone had a wireless, a PC, a desktop, or a notebook with some type of wireless capability. But the reality is that the service provider, a category that Calix knows quite a bit about, I must say, there's lots and lots of opportunity from a value proposition standpoint. For consumers, it's obviously, they want to be able to embrace something called a managed Wi-Fi experience, which obviously Calix knows quite a bit about. They don't want to really be, I use the phrase CIO in my opening comments. They want all the benefits. They recognize all the risks in terms of security risks, because that network now has to be managed in some way. People are doing it. Some people who are enthusiasts are doing it, because they have the technology background. But let's face it, most consumers don't want that responsibility. They want remote tech support when they have an issue. They want home coverage, home wireless coverage that's optimized. They want better security updates that don't require the user to spend any time, thinking about updating the firmware on their router. They want it done in a seamless background type of way. Parental controls, obviously that's a big deal with families who, with fathers and mothers who have big families, and they want to be able to manage that access for their children's apps in a very unique way. But even from a peace of mind and future proofing standpoint, it's a big deal. I mean, people don't want. It's kind of like what I like to tell people in home security: when you put a sensor on your window that you only can get to with a super duper high ladder, you don't want to know that the company went out of business. Now I've got to replace that sensor. They want to be able to have a long-lasting relationship with the technology that they're installing in their homes. And Greg, just want to get your reaction to some of those things from a managed Wi-Fi support and why service providers can really come to the rescue of many subscribers who really don't want. They want all the benefits, but they don't want all the agony that goes along with supporting the latest and greatest wireless technology in their homes.
Well, as you and George probably know, I could talk forever about managed Wi-Fi, so I'll try to keep it brief. When I first joined Calix, after spending so many years with Alcatel-Lucent selling to companies like AT&T and Verizon, I found it very surprising that so many of the smaller service providers that we deal with at Calix were investing literally tens of millions of dollars in building fiber optic networks, building GPON and XGS-PON right to people's homes, and then handing them an Ethernet cable and saying, now go figure out the Wi-Fi. And I'm oversimplifying, and I'm not trying to be critical, because a lot of them just like, listen, I don't want to be in the Wi-Fi business. But as our CEO says, if you're not in the managed Wi-Fi business, you're in the unmanaged Wi-Fi business. What I mean by that is they're going to call you no matter what. You're providing the internet connection. So whether you're providing support or not, like you talked about right in the top left there, Mark, the customer associates their connection with you as a service provider. So I think it's incumbent upon you to take that responsibility, but it also has huge opportunities, and you outlined them very well here, right? I mean, it's much easier to troubleshoot issues without having to roll a truck remotely.
Yes.
Like the products that we offer, I always joke, you can do everything you can do remotely other than physically unplug the router. You can do when, remotely. So I think there's all kinds of benefits that you've outlined here from the service provider perspective. Of course, obvious benefits for the consumer. And I think when service providers sit down and think about it, about the cost of a truck roll, I'm now hearing with the price of gas and everything that's going on, we used to say $125. We're now looking at $75, $200 for a truck roll. So it becomes a bit of a I don't want to say no brainer, but most of the service providers I talk to really see the value of managed Wi-Fi, and it allows you to talk about what we're doing today, right? Which is always offer them the latest and greatest technology. So every 30 months or every 36 months, you send them a new Wi-Fi gateway, and they're keeping up with the latest and greatest technology. And you can charge a small fee, easily get your money back, but also provide a great service to customers. The last thing I'll say is if you look at consumer grade systems, for example, and George and I obviously keep a close eye on that. When their 6E systems first came out, and I know you use one of them, Mark, a 3-pack was $1,500.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, right? So for the average consumer, that's a lot of money. Whereas a service provider can say, hey, you can just have a mesh 6E system, and we're going to charge you $4 a month or whatever the heck it is, right? So it's much more affordable as well. So I promised I wouldn't rant, and then I ranted, so I'm sorry about that.
No. I want to pull George into this, but that brand I will not recommend. I mean, it's a fine product, But I have to tell you, every time I upgrade my home network, it's a bit of an adventure. Now I've done it so many times that it's kind of now a bit of old hat. So it's easy for me to do. But to your point, since the wireless protocols are changing very quickly, Wi-Fi 7 is not too far away. There'll be a Wi-Fi 8, there'll be a Wi-Fi 9, and technology in this space is not going to ever come to a halt. The idea of having a managed Wi-Fi experience where the consumer doesn't have to care about it, all of a sudden, they're 18 months from now, 24 months from now, when that new protocol becomes embedded in your devices, all that subscriber has to do is plug it in, and they're back in business. So, George, let me flip this over to you. What do you think is the most important part of the service provider experience for delivering Wi-Fi?
So one of the things, Mark, what I would say upfront is that anytime when there's an opportunity, there's a responsibility. What I mean by that is that, Wi-Fi is a great opportunity for everybody, right? But the bad guys also see it too, right?
Yes.
So, when you look at security and things like that, I mean, they would use that opportunity to try to, build money out of people, like ransomware and things like that, right? So one of the really key things that I see for a service provider is really in the cybersecurity area, right? You want customers to be able to surf the web and do everything that they want to do at home without the worry that they're going to get attacked, right? So that's where the service provider comes in, right? To protect the customer from cyber attack and things of that nature. And of course, one of the things that people don't realize is that when you think about Ethernet versus Wi-Fi, Ethernet is a wire, so it's a deterministic technology. Whereas Wi-Fi is over the air, right? When it's over the air, all kinds of things could happen, right?
Generally bad things can happen. It's not.
Yeah. So that's an area that people don't realize that, there's a big difference between wire and wireless, right? So when it's wireless, all kinds of things could happen. That's why managed Wi-Fi is a must for a service provider to keep a customer happy. And not only that, but maintain that customer without any churn. So.
I could not agree with you more. Let us flip to the next topic here, and that is, and George, I want to pull you into it because you're the resident technical expert on the podcast this morning. The word spectrum, if you're in the business, people get what spectrum is. I want you to talk a little bit about why spectrum is so important, such an important part of the Wi-Fi 6E experience. And I think consumers need to understand that the wireless signals that kind of float around us all day, a lot of that is managed by the FCC, and they have to license that technology. And they do it not because they just want to keep technology down. They do that for a whole variety of safety reasons and a lot of issues because you don't, there's many wireless signals that you don't want to be exposed to from a health standpoint. So they generally have to make sure that the technology is safe before they start licensing that part of that spectrum to companies to utilize. So let's talk a little bit about what Wi-Fi 6E is from a spectrum standpoint and why that part of the equation is so important.
So let me start by telling you that the FCC had auctioned off a spectrum, what we call a C-band. C-band sits between 3 and 4 gigahertz, okay? That spectrum was only 100 megahertz wide, 100 megahertz wide. And AT&T, Verizon, and all the big guys paid $80 billion for that spectrum, only 100 megahertz wide, okay? So if I correlate that into the 6 gigahertz, which is 1200 megahertz, that's 12 times.
Yes.
So if you times 12 times 80 billion, now you can work out the math, close to $1 trillion if the FCC were to auction off 6 gigahertz. That's how much this band is worth, right? But yet the FCC is basically opening it up to for us to use freely, right? So that's the value that we're looking at, over $1 trillion value in the spectrum, right? Now, why is that important? Because if you look at 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, they are pretty saturated because everybody uses those spectrums, right? Literally, every morning when I come into my office and I log on, right, I could see 10 of my neighbors' access points. they're all using 2.4 or 5 gigahertz, right? So this thing gets really crowded, especially in urban environment. That's why the FCC decided to open the 6 gigahertz to basically allow people more bandwidth. One other thing I would say is that if you look at the 6 gigahertz, right, there are 14 80 megahertz channels, right? 14. So if you're in an apartment building where you see everybody's, access point and things like that, you're basically, let's say even at 5 gigahertz, realistically, you really only have 2 80 megahertz channel because the other one are DFS, right, which is not guaranteed. Comparing the 80, right, comparing the 14. So what that means is that, if you're just using 5 gigahertz, you're going to get a lot of interference from all your neighbors. But in 6 gigahertz, basically, you could, all 14 neighbors around you can each has its own 80 megahertz without any interference. Now, what about the 15th neighbor and 16 and so on and so forth? Well, they're far enough away, they can reuse that spectrum all over again, just like the cellular network, right? So that's the genius of 6 gigahertz that the FCC had opened up.
So Greg, let me get you to chime in from a service provider perspective and the fact that there's really a messaging opportunity. I like to think of these type of challenges when new technologies come out from what's the opportunity. Absolutely. And why the service providers have to take a much more aggressive position on articulating some of this with really good, effective marketing messaging, because a lot of what George just said is 100% accurate. There's lots of tangible benefits to it that we'll get into in a second. But for the average person who's just managing that has a nice wireless network at home, again, that word spectrum kind of, makes the eyes roll back a bit. So talk about it from a service provider and the messaging opportunity.
Yeah. Well, everything that George says, of course, is accurate, but the average customer doesn't want or need to understand why it's the case that with the old router they had, to George's point, same thing. I live in the suburbs and I can still see 10 different wireless networks in my neighborhood. I don't live in Manhattan, right? So he's absolutely right, but they don't understand that the fact that they can see it means that it could be causing interference. All they care about is that they have the best experience possible. So the messaging that I always suggest to service providers is focus on being the partner to make technology simple. So they may not understand that there's X number of channels. Some of them don't even understand that, why is it that my microwave affects my wire? Well, because they're also using microwaves, hence the name microwave, right? A lot of people don't realize that lots of devices in their home, their garage door opener, the baby monitor, can cause interference. The beauty of 6 gigahertz is none of those devices have 6 gigahertz radios or antennas on them. So this is now clean, unfettered bandwidth, right? Or frequency, I should say. So the message that I would give is everybody out there is buying the latest and greatest devices, right? The new Android phones already support 6 gigahertz. Some of the latest new laptops support 6 gigahertz. Some smart TVs the smart consumer electronics companies are like, wait a minute, there's Wi-Fi that doesn't have competition from other bands. Let's get a device out there as soon as possible to take advantage of it. We strongly suspect Apple will announce something at their event in the August-September timeframe. And then, so I think people want to take advantage of technology, and they want to know that the infrastructure that supports it is going to keep up. And I think that's a unique positioning for the service provider is we're your technology partner. You buy the latest and greatest device, give us a call, and we'll tell you how to keep up. So to your point, Mark, about ripping and replacing your router every single time and what an adventure that is, right? Our strategy, which we can talk about a little bit later, is you want to do 6E, but you only have 1 or 2 devices. Don't rip out your router. Just put a 6E mesh system in your house, one unit, right? It's not for providing more coverage, because our systems actually provide good coverage with only 1 access point, but it becomes a dedicated signal just for that TV or just for that virtual reality or that gaming system, whatever it might be. So to kind of revisit here, it's about keeping technology simple, but keeping up with the latest and greatest advances. That's what I think the service provider differentiator is here, in my opinion.
Right, and I'll just add on one thought on that before we flip to the next slide, is that to your point, just about every PC on the market that's been sold over the last year and a half has at least Wi-Fi 6. We're gonna see 6E PCs later this year. Even Apple has gotten on board. Sometimes they're a little bit slower to the party.
They were slow with Wi-Fi 6, but yeah.
But the interesting thing is, to flip this upside down, if there's the highest probability that most people already have Wi-Fi 6 or 6E devices in their home, yet they have a slower network. So they're hampering the performance of the network because they have client devices that have the faster protocol support, yet the router, for whatever reason, might be a legacy router that might be 3 or 4 years old, which presumably uses a much slower protocol.
But again, that's part of the managed Wi-Fi value prop, right, Mark? And I follow a lot of our customers on Facebook and their different social media, and they do a good job explaining why you have to have the latest and greatest router. Well, why not just send it to them?
Yes.
Every 36 months. That's what my service provider does. They'll just call me and say, hey, we need an appointment to come give you a new router because it's the latest and greatest technology. It's going to do this and this for you. It doesn't cost me anything. It's the same amount per month I'm paying for the old one. Done deal, right? So that's another big value prop for managed Wi-Fi. Absolutely.
No, that's exactly right. Let us talk about let's go back into the whole big deal nature about Wi-Fi 6E, and then of course conclude 6 as well. Again, George, I'll flip back to you because you are our technical resource here. Wi-Fi 6E, like 6, has unmatched speed, potential with the right client device. It really has massive capacity in terms of the number of devices it can support on a network. By its very nature, it eliminates a lot of congestion. Devices don't conflict with each other like in the old days, where you could have that could be a problem, not just with other PCs or devices, but with microwaves, because it's operating on the wrong frequency. And then there is the ultra low latency piece. I was talking to Greg about this the other day. I didn't think that I'd see a huge benefit from a latency standpoint with my 6E implementation that I have at home. And I'm a gamer. I freely admit that. I love to play online games, especially cross-platform games. I won't get into it because that's a different podcast. But the latency is so unbelievably sharp that it's literally instantaneous. And if you're a online gamer, and there's a lot of them out there in families, they appreciate that ultra low latency benefit that you drive. I mean, obviously it has non-gaming benefits as well. But George, let me flip it to you to get your reaction to the big deal nature of 6E.
Yeah, so I'll just talk about each block for a second. So the peak speed, right? Even at 5 gigahertz, you could get 160 megahertz channel. But really, there's only one, and you have to concatenate them together, right? Mm-hmm. Assuming that you're not using DFS channels. That is really difficult to try to get both Uni 1 and Uni 3 together in a, forget about dense neighborhood, even in a suburban neighborhood, it's almost impossible to get that. So that means the chance of ever getting 160 is almost impossible. But as we saw on the last slide, right, there are 7 160 channels open. So to get 160 is quite easy, actually, right? So because of that, you basically get a tremendous amount of channel width for what you want to do. And with that channel width, obviously, it comes with the speed, right, the bandwidth that you need. And each one of these blocks kind of interrelated, right? The second block is the massive capacity, right? As I mentioned before, in an MDU environment where you live in an apartment, which a lot of us do, right? In this country, most people live in the city. It's very important that you get good Wi-Fi without interference. And Wi-Fi 6 is really the answer because of the number of channels available, independent channels available. And by the way, because we have all kinds of technology built into our product, right? So FCS is one of the technologies that's built in the product. Fast channel switching, right? So that means we can sense the interfering channels and immediately find an open channel and switch over to it. So just like what Greg was saying before, all these things that we talk about are all automated, right? Nothing to worry about, not something a user has to get their hands dirty. This is all done by the router itself, right? And then the last thing is the ultra low latency. Just like what you were saying before, right, Mark? You're amazed at the latency. Well, part of that is because there's nobody else interfering you, right? That when you're on 5 gigahertz, first of all, your spectrum is going to be, your channel width is going to be very small. Second thing is that there's a lot of interference. But in 6 gigahertz, there's nobody interfering you, right? And the channel width is huge. So that's why you get such a low latency and be able to do all these gaming and things like that. Now, the interesting thing, last thing I would say is that because you're taking very high bandwidth worth of application out of 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. Therefore, you are freeing up 2.4 and 5 gigahertz for other lower bandwidth, functionality like the baby monitor, the doorbell, and Alexa and all those kind of things. So it's really a win-win situation, right? In a 5 gigahertz backhaul environment, is even more acute, right? Because you're using 5 gigahertz to do both front haul and backhaul. So you're really penalizing the front haul guys, the clients, because you're using the same spectrum to do backhaul. But in 6 gigahertz, you don't do that, right? You take 6 gigahertz as a backhaul, you're freeing up all the space for 5 gigahertz and 2.4, right? So it's really what I call win-win-win situation.
Well, Greg, let me just tease up the whole the service provider implication of this, because again, these are such huge benefits, and the message opportunity, I think.
Well, I think there's a couple of things I think about. We have a lot of debates here in Calix about some of these numbers that you're sharing, Mark, about people getting 5 gigs to their home and 10 gigs to their home, and the reality is there just isn't a device that needs that kind of bandwidth, right? But what we're trying to get across here is I like to use the analogy of the water that comes into your house. When I bought my house a few years ago, I had a housing inspection, and he said, okay, go around the house and turn on every single faucet just to make sure you have water pressure in every single, sink. I don't want all the water pressure that's coming to my house on one shower, right? It's like that bad episode of Seinfeld where Kramer gets in the shower and the shower, that's not what you need. You want to have water to your toilet while you're in the shower and vice versa, right? That's the exact same thing with Wi-Fi. It's about having that fat pipe to your house, but also having Wi-Fi for all your different devices and spreading it out. So when you look at 6E, like George said, you have the big benefit of people that are into gaming, people that are into virtual reality, augmented reality, and I want a system with a 10 gig LAN port. I want 10 gigs to that device. Well, there isn't a device that does that, but they want it because they want the most bandwidth, because what's the way to make up for latency is to throw more bandwidth at it. Right? Yes. Every time you run into bandwidth, you worry about latency, and latency is that reaction time. So that's what you're talking about, right, Mark, in the gaming, or if you're in a video conference, if the words are not matching the person's mouth, right, that's what one of the symptoms of having bad latency. So from a service provider perspective, again, it's about providing the latest technology to keep up with the devices that you are buying in your home. So 6E, yes, it's about more speed and more bandwidth, which we're always going to have that race, but latency becomes really interesting when you want to do targeted messages, because believe me, Mark, your service provider knows that you're a gamer. They don't have to look at your data to know you're a gamer. So they should reach out to you and say, hey, Mark, do you want the latest 6E system or mesh satellite to help your gaming better? And that's a targeted message that you could go, wow, yeah, that's something I'm definitely interested in. So that's a good opportunity for service providers.
Absolutely. Let us flip to the next slide here. And that is, there we go. There's an optimization, implication of Wi-Fi 6E. And this is a little bit of an eye chart, but I think it's really representative. And the thing, George, I want you to get to chime in. I mean, truth be told, 6E is really pushing the envelope in terms of what applications require that kind of bandwidth and that kind of latency benefits. But my prediction is, and I don't think I'm the only one, and I said this at the top of the podcast, when AR and VR applications start to come online, and they will. I mean, let's face it, once Apple unveils their Apple glasses or whatever solution they bring to market, and they have a killer app, and I believe one of the reasons why Apple's probably hasn't stuck their toe in the water yet is they really want to refine a great killer application that will appeal to a large people to buy some type of device that will go on their head, whatever it is. That's going to require a lot of bandwidth, and a lot of technology that's low latency in orientation. So to me, there's a future-proofing element of 6E that I think is important. And George, let me turn it over to you to comment on that aspect.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, right? These are the most common applications that people are thinking of. But let me bring something up that people may not have thought of before. And that is that, if you look at what Facebook is doing on Meta now, what they want to do is really wire up the entire world, right? The reason behind that is that their mantra is that the more people get internet access, is better for Facebook, right? Because eventually they're going to join Facebook and things like that. So the whole idea of community Wi-Fi comes into play, right? Especially in developing countries where you really cannot afford to have Wi-Fi in every single home, because some of those developing countries, their income just doesn't match up with that, right? So what that means is that you really need more like, having a pole in the center of town, or 2 or 3 poles in the center of town, and everybody can access it, right? Which we'll call community Wi-Fi. So in that situation, you may have a couple of hundred households accessing from that same pole, which is like a fixed wireless access today, right? So for that, obviously you want as much bandwidth as possible, right? So that's really another angle to look at Wi-Fi 6E, is that it's beyond the, first world country application where you have the VR and AR and all those things. But when you think about the rest of the world, the community Wi-Fi and people be able to get access into internet is very, very important.
Yes.
Even
Yes.
in this country, right? So
Yes.
I was surprised to find that, there are a lot of, underprivileged neighborhoods. A lot of homes don't have Wi-Fi because they
Yes.
can't afford it, right?
Right.
So now if I'm if I'm close enough to one of those neighborhoods and, I put a Wi-Fi 6E, I'm more than happy to share that with the underprivileged, neighborhood to access Wi-Fi, right? So,
Yes.
but you need a big pipe for that, and that's where this comes in.
Yes. Greg, your thoughts?
No, I would just mirror everything that George just said, and I think one of the things that that pandemic taught us is a lot of what George is talking about in terms of inequity. Right, I was at an event in April or May down in Keystone, Colorado, and we had a senator address us and talk about this phenomenon of people driving to their local McDonald's or Starbucks so that their kids could do their homework because the Wi-Fi was unreliable at home or wasn't good enough. And I think
Yes.
the U.S. government has responded to that with all of the funding initiatives for making sure that we get fiber-based broadband and high-speed broadband to rural parts of America. I think the important thing to keep in mind, to George's point exactly, is the Wi-Fi has to match that experience. The access network and the home network are not separable anymore, right? They're one thing. People don't distinguish between the two. So the Wi-Fi has to keep up with all these great advances we see in XGS-PON, where we're getting 10 gigs to the subscriber home. We have to make sure the Wi-Fi can keep up. And as George pointed out, it's not just about these new applications, which are definitely important, but it's about new business opportunities as well, like community Wi-Fi and looking at small businesses. And for service providers, from their perspective, it opens up whole new markets and new opportunities for them to either make more revenue or provide more differentiation from their existing service, or just better serve their community, depending on what their business model is.
That's absolutely correct. That's absolutely correct. Absolutely correct and on target here. Don't want to spend too much time here because we've talked about it before, but
Sure.
there is a managed Wi-Fi story here. We kind of talked a little bit about it before. Greg, let me start with you in terms of just real quickly, from your perspective, when you look at the benefits of managed Wi-Fi. I know as someone who's a technology aficionado that there are times that I really wish I had a managed Wi-Fi experience. Purely, and it's hard for me to do that because I evaluate a lot of technology that changes every 6 months. But I'm unusual. Most people, once they have something and they want to set it and forget it. And let's talk a little bit about that, because I think it's really, really important. And there are very, very specific benefits that I think
for sure.
more people should appreciate.
Well, there's 3 quick things that I'll mention here. This chart is something that we worked on in the past, Mark. It has to do with what's driving people to call the help desk, and the number one reason is Wi-Fi issues, right? So I think there's 3 elements of that, Mark. I would agree with you. The average person doesn't want to worry about it, so we build as much into our products to automate things as easily as possible. Like George hinted at, we've got like dynamic channel selection. We handle DFS. We do node steering, band steering, all that kind of stuff. That all it means is that as the customer moves around their home, the router is going to decide what the connection is that's best for them. They don't have to switch radios and switch access points. That gets done automatically. So that's a big thing. Now, to your point about being a technology aficionado, I think one of the things we have to do as an industry better is put some control back into users' hands through things like mobile apps. And yes, maybe the person doesn't want to do all kinds of advanced settings, but the average person probably wants to be able to use their app to see where the best place is to put their router in their home. They want to be able to run a speed test. They want to be able to change their passphrase, or create a guest network when people come over. Some of the more common things. So, and I think rather than call the service provider for that, they'd rather be able to do it themselves. So yes, I would agree that we want to make sure that, we don't make things complicated, but for the average things, the typical things that a customer wants to do, I think it's important to give them the control to do that. And that's something that we're a firm believer of at Calix, working with our service provider partners. Yeah.
George, your thoughts?
Yeah. So one of the things that I kind of want to help us to look a little bit further into the future, actually for us, a lot of what I'm going to say is already here, is more of a predictive analysis. Meaning that, we have so many customers. In case people don't know, Calix has about 1,600 customers in the US. Majority of them are in the US. We have enough data to allow us to provide predictive analysis from a machine learning perspective. So why is that important? Well, what's important is the reason we have 1,600 customers is that some of those little towns in the middle of Wyoming may only have 200 people. That BSP may be 4 guys in the office. That's it, right? They don't have an army of customer service reps, right? They have 4 guys, 2 guys maybe driving a truck out there to fix things, and then 2 guys in the central office manage network. You can't expect them to do a lot of things, right? So they need the intelligence to allow them to automate a lot of things, right? So our predictive analysis, when we see a lot of data coming through, we can kind of predict that some of those network may eventually kind of turn over or go bad. So we basically, one, either fix it for them automatically, or 2, allow them to decide to override our automation, right? So those are the kind of technologies that our customers are looking for. They don't want 1,500 alarms, coming at them every single day. Right? They want you to take care of everything automatically, right? Just let me know what you got taken care of. And for a specific alarm, let me override them. Don't take care of them for me, right? I want these 5 alarms are much more critical for me. I want to deal with it myself. But rest of it, you can just automate, take care of things, right? So that's what's, what we're working on. And basically a lot of things is already in play. But in the future, you're going to see less and less hand-on needed from the service provider, right? A lot of things going to be automated. So,
yeah, and just a point I would make on that, because it often goes overlooked. In a managed Wi-Fi environment, the data that is being collected is being used to create a better customized experience, managed experience for the user. That sometimes goes, it's not about just you forfeiting control to the service provider. A lot of that, to Greg's point, there's some things you obviously want to control, like parental access is a big deal that can be done. Calix has a great mobile app for that the end user can use to kind of manage that part of the experience. But a lot of the data that's being collected is being utilized to manage a much better experience, because not every home has the same usage model patterns. There are kids who are gaming, there are kids who are doing, there are parents who are streaming TV. You might have 5 or 6 different types of usage models that will have all kinds of different Wi-Fi bandwidth requirements that need to be managed in an optimized manner. And that's why I think the managed Wi-Fi experience is so beneficial, because it provides that in a very smart, algorithmic type of way here.
Mark, can I just make one quick point about data? I want to be really careful that we're clear here, that you're 100% right, and George is right about how we use data to optimize the experience. But just to be clear, Calix is not in the data collection and sales.
Yes, correct.
We don't even aggregate data between service providers. We never publish it, we never share it, and we never will. So just to George's point, unlike some of the companies that we compete with, our objective is not to collect data. Our objective is to provide the best experience, and that is our service provider customers' objective as well. So yes, we use the data to make sure that, hey, maybe you could use a faster connection to your home, or maybe you could use a mesh satellite, or how can we make your experience better? It's not about, can we sell you some hairspray or baking soda, or just the examples I'm using, because I now get targeted ads on Facebook almost every day by the words that I say in front of my Google Home, but that's a whole other conversation.
George, Greg is obviously upset about all the, I guess, all the foot powder commercials he's getting on ads he's getting on Facebook. But let's just wrap this up in the last a couple of slides with some of the product offerings, because again, you come from very modest roots, going back a few years to having a very comprehensive portfolio of solutions. So George, I'll just tee this up to you very, very quickly in terms of just the types of solutions that are out there that Calix has in their portfolio.
Yeah, one of the things that we believe is that unlike other providers who only offer you one type of box, which is like a mesh network. So if you have a small house, you use one box. If you have a big house, you use 5 boxes, right? That kind of strategy doesn't really work well for customers, because the more mesh you have, the more latency you have, number one. Number two, as I said before, right, Wi-Fi technology is over the air. The more over the air transmission you have, the more chance of loss or interference. So when we started this whole journey at Calix, we believe that the single hop is the best option for a subscriber, right? Anytime when they can access the main router, that would be the best experience. And how do you do that? Well, you do that with the most powerful Wi-Fi solution you can provide, right? With the highest power that you can provide. So you can see all these portfolio that we're doing right now, right? Whether it's a single box or mesh or integrated ONT, and in the future, of course, Wi-Fi 6E, outdoor unit, indoor unit, PoE, all those kinds of things. Everything is built around the fact that different people have different requirements, right? Not one size shoes fits all.
Correct. Well, let's wrap this up on the product philosophy that Calix has. We've talked a little bit about the market, some of the challenges, the opportunities for service providers, a lot of kind of territory that we covered. But Greg, let me get you just kind of take us home here in terms of the philosophy at Calix, because there's a lot of product discussions that obviously never see the light of day. That's the way most companies operate. But you guys have an interesting philosophy that I think is unique. It has tremendous benefits for subscribers and end users, of course. But let's talk a little bit about that before we wrap up the podcast.
Yeah, the last thing I'll just mention on the last slide is the coincidence between our old way of doing things and new ways, George's arrival, right? I mean, George is always thinking of, exactly to your point, about those use cases and making sure that we're filling all those different needs. But it's not about the hardware. And I know it sounds silly to say that when we just showed a slide with a whole bunch of products. Yes, there are different products that fit the need, but we take the same approach that Microsoft and Apple and other companies take, right? You look at Microsoft world. If you're an IT manager and you're managing a network, you don't care whether the PCs are Lenovo's or HP's or Asus or whatever brand it is. As long as they're all running Windows 10 or Windows 11, they all look the same to you, whether they have USB ports or Ethernet ports or not, right? That's the approach that we've taken with our portfolio of premises systems. Doesn't matter if you have a U4 or a U6 or a U6X, they all run the same common platform, what we call our experience innovation platform. So from a service provider perspective, they all look the same. Yes, the features underneath are a bit different. They have different model numbers. Some have more ports than the other. But in terms of integrating them into their network, they can now integrate new systems in a day. Whereas before, any new RG that you put in your network, oh my gosh, we have to test it. We have to make sure it's not going to cause this problem and that problem. No. The new system looks exactly to your network like the old system from 2 years ago, because they're all running the same operating system, the same platform. And that's a big philosophical difference. And of course, because of that, or not because of it, but alongside of that, it's a containerized architecture. So we can install containers. So you talked about our parental controls, for example, right, Mark? If a service provider wants to offer that to a customer, they literally go into Support Cloud and turn it on and turn it off. They don't have to find the partner, do the integration, figure out the pricing. Oh my gosh, that can take 18 months. You want network-wide security, like George talked about. You turn it on or turn it off. You want to offer the Command IQ app. You want to offer Arlo cameras. The list goes on and on. You can turn it on and off with a touch of a button. And again, that's another benefit of our approach. So it's not just a router that goes in your house and never changes. That's why we don't use the word router and gateway at Calix. We refer to it as a system, because it has that common platform. It has that containerized architecture, and you can add new services and new features, for the next 10 years. We're going to keep developing. Yes, there'll be new form factors, and George will make sure we're keeping up the latest and greatest technology. But again, they'll be easy to integrate into your network from a service provider perspective. So that is a unique approach. I'm glad that you mentioned it. And I think it's something that really differentiates Calix in the market.
Well, let's do this here because we've kind of run out of time here. But before we get off the end the podcast, George, any parting words of wisdom in terms of the way we've covered a lot of territory, a lot of ground here? But do you have any closing comments you'd like to be able to impart to the audience?
Well, I think that we are in a very exciting period of technology. And we look forward to continue to serve our customers and continue to make the subscriber experience top notch.
Great. Greg, any closing thoughts?
No, I just want to thank you for the opportunity, Mark, and for those people that are sticking through. We're at 50 minutes. I know that's longer than what we talked about, but I do think we're hoping that we tackled quite a few different topics here. So I hope it was interesting for everybody. I really enjoyed the discussion. So thank you for the opportunity.
No, well, the reason why these podcasts sometimes go long is we've had a lot of great material to talk about, and we could probably talk for another hour or so.
Yeah, exactly.
if we had the time. But guys, listen, thanks for taking the time to join me for today's podcast. For our viewing and listening audience, thanks for making the Smart Tech Check podcast part of your day or commute. Please make sure that you hit the like and subscribe buttons at the end of today's podcast, and don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Mark Vina Tech Guy. And until next time, have a great week. George and Greg, thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark.